Three Apache widows mocked the cowboy until their tribe leader ordered them to marry him. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The flat land near Cedar Bluff held a hard, steady quiet as Billy Rowan approached the trading stones with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who no longer expected surprises. His horse walked with a tired rhythm, hooves pressing into dry soil that had not seen rain in weeks. The late autumn air carried a cold bite that settled into his coat, seams, and made each exhale show in front of him for a brief moment before fading into the open space. Billy's life had narrowed after the river crossing that took his younger brother 3 years earlier. Since then, he had worked odd jobs, avoided large towns, and chosen routes where fewer questions were asked. Delivering supplies to the Apache settlement was one of the few tasks he accepted without hesitation. It gave him routine, which kept his mind quiet. And it kept him moving, which kept the grief from sitting too deeply. He wasn't there to make friends or negotiate. His purpose was simple: bring the promised goods before winter reached full strength, then return home before the night winds made travel dangerous. He dismounted with a low grunt, the strain in his knees familiar. His boots touched the dirt, and he took a moment to straighten his back before loosening the rope that held the crates to the saddle. The wood felt rough beneath his gloves, the nails slightly raised at the corners. He checked each crate automatically: fire starters, dry beans, cloth, and tools requested by the tribe's elder. None of the work required thought, but it occupied his hands, which helped keep old memories from rising. A faint shift of movement drew his eyes slightly to the left. 3 Apache widows stood at the far edge of the clearing. They formed a tight line, their expressions guarded. Their presence wasn't unexpected. Billy knew they often helped with distribution of supplies, but their focused attention on him created a pressure he hadn't prepared for. He didn't flinch. He didn't want to give the impression that he felt threatened, even though a quiet, familiar tension lifted into his shoulders. Nara, the eldest, watched him with a firm stance. Her braid hung over her chest, and copper beads clicked softly when the breeze changed direction. She wasn't hostile, but she wasn't welcoming either. She had lost her husband in a raid earlier that year, and the weight of that loss showed in the sharp stillness of her eyes. "He moves like he has nowhere else to be," she said, her tone steady, carrying a restrained edge. Saya, the middle widow, stood slightly behind her. She had a cautious posture, as if always assessing whether an unseen threat might approach. Her husband had died from fever the previous winter, leaving her in charge of her late mother's tools and what little she could salvage. "Or like he doesn't want anyone to look at him too long," she murmured. Talani, the youngest, stood with her hands clasped loosely before her. She had survived the shortest marriage of the 3. Her husband died in a hunting accident only months after they wed. She endured grief in quieter ways, often more visible in small gestures than words. "He looks worn out," she said in a low voice, unsure if she should feel sympathy or keep her distance. Billy heard their voices clearly. The clearing was too open to hide much. He kept unloading anyway. He didn't respond, and he didn't look their way. He had grown used to being misread. Silence was safer than explaining himself, especially to strangers who already had reasons to distrust white men. He lifted another crate, feeling the slight pull in his left shoulder, a reminder of the injury he earned during a cattle drive years ago. As he stepped back to adjust the line of goods, another presence entered the scene. Chief Makona approached from the main path leading from the Apache settlement. His walk was calm but purposeful. The years had made his posture heavier, but his authority remained unmistakable. When he reached the group, the widows straightened immediately, their expressions tightening with respect and uncertainty. Makona's eyes moved across each face before settling on Billy. "You delivered more than expected," he observed, noting the extra sack of grain tied behind the saddle. "You didn't have to bring that." Billy replied in a low, direct voice. "Figured you'd need it before the snows came." Makona nodded once, acknowledging the simple truth without praise. Then he turned toward the 3 widows, taking in the guarded expressions that had not softened since Billy's arrival. The tension between the two sides was unmistakable. It wasn't open hostility, but it wasn't comfortable either. It felt like two different histories standing across from one another, each waiting to see how much of the past would shape this moment. Makona spoke calmly but firmly. Nara, Saya, Talani, your situation is known. Winter here does not forgive those without strong shelter. The loss of your husbands has already taken enough from you. You're not meant to endure the season without support. The widows tensed. They already knew they were vulnerable, but hearing it aloud tightened something inside them. Billy shifted slightly, unsure where this conversation was headed. Makona continued, voice steady. This man has shown fair dealing for years. He keeps his word. He does not bring trouble to others. Saya's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in wary reflection. Then Makona spoke the decision that changed every expression in the clearing. For the season, you will join his household. You will share work, share space, and ensure each other's survival. This is not a command from authority. It is a cultural choice meant to protect lives. The widows reacted immediately. Nara stepped forward. We never asked for this, she said, though her voice carried more confusion than resistance. Saya looked at Billy with a mix of uncertainty and scrutiny. We don't know him. Talani lowered her gaze, her breathing unsteady. Billy felt heat rise in his chest, a familiar reaction when caught off guard. He didn't feel offended. He felt exposed. He hadn't expected responsibility for three strangers. He hadn't expected to hear his lonely routines described as something needing correction. His instinct urged him to retreat, but there was no ground to move toward that didn't seem like giving disrespect. Makona looked directly at him. You didn't choose to isolate yourself, Billy. You fell into it after loss. There is a difference. Billy held the elder's gaze. He hated being read so easily, yet he knew it was true. His brother's death had altered everything. Where he lived, how he slept, how much he trusted others. After a long, quiet moment, he finally spoke. If it keeps them safe, then they can come. It wasn't enthusiasm. It wasn't fear. It was a decision shaped by duty, empathy, and the sudden awareness that refusing might harm people who had already endured enough. The widows absorbed his words carefully. None looked relieved, but none stepped back either. Something unspoken passed through them. Acknowledgement that survival sometimes required uncomfortable beginnings. Makona, satisfied, stepped aside to let the new group face each other openly. Billy gathered the last crate and tied the rope around the saddle. The widows stood together, their attention shifting between one another and the man they would now rely on. No one smiled. No one relaxed. But no one turned away. The late autumn wind moved again across the clearing. Billy's horse snorted once, sensing the change in its rider's mood. The widows adjusted their shawls as the temperature dropped. Makona walked back toward the settlement trail, leaving them in the muted light of the lowering sun. Their lives had been separate that morning. By sundown, they were bound by an arrangement none of them expected and none yet understood. Billy Rowan looked at the long path home and took a slow breath before starting forward, aware that whatever waited for them, there would change all four lives through the long winter ahead. The walk toward Billy Rowan's homestead began in an uneasy line, the four of them moving at different rhythms despite sharing the same narrow trail. Billy led the way with a slow, deliberate stride, guiding his horse by the reins. Nara followed a few paces behind him, her posture rigid and her eyes tracking every cluster of brush as if danger might come from the smallest movement. Saya walked beside her, quieter, measuring each footstep with cautious precision. Talani stayed at the rear, holding her shawl close, trying to understand how her life had changed in the span of one afternoon. Billy's land sat 2 miles east of the trading stones, a distance he normally covered in silence. Today, the silence carried weight. He felt the tension behind him even without turning around. The sound of their boots striking the ground fell into an uneven pattern, revealing nerves none of them tried to hide. His mind worked through the arrangement, trying to settle on a clear plan. He had space. He had blankets. He had enough food to last a while. But sharing his home was a new situation, and the uncertainty pulled at him more than he wanted to admit. The widows used the time to study him from behind. Nara tried to judge his intentions through his steady gait and the way he scanned the horizon at regular intervals. She watched his hands, noticing that he never tightened the reins too hard. That small detail eased her distrust only slightly. Saya kept her focus on the terrain, but she glanced at Billy's back now and then, trying to determine what kind of man accepted responsibility he never asked for. Talani observed the distance between each of them, unsure how much space she was supposed to keep. When Billy's cabin finally came into view, the widows slowed, taking in the structure with careful attention. It was a simple, one-room home with a small storage shed to the left and a fenced corral that held 2 horses, Billy's bay and a young sorrel he had been breaking in slowly. The cabin's walls were built from thick logs, tightly fitted, showing years of upkeep. A pile of chopped firewood rested under an awning near the door, stacked neatly and covered with a tarp. The place looked prepared for harsh weather, but lived in by someone who planned quietly and expected no help. Billy opened the cabin door first and stepped aside. "Go in," he said, his voice calm, but edged with the awareness that they were entering a space he had kept private for years. The widows entered cautiously. Inside, the cabin held clean order. A wood stove stood on the right wall, its iron door slightly ajar from the morning's fire. 2 chairs sat at a small table, their surfaces worn smooth. A single bed occupied the far corner, simple, tightly made, and positioned near a shelf that held tools, folded shirts, and a lantern. The opposite corner led to a small storage room with a partially open door, revealing boxes, rope, and a few blankets folded in stacks. Nara scanned everything quickly, looking for signs of danger or neglect. She found neither. The place felt lived in, but not careless. Saya moved toward the stove, pressing her hand against the iron surface to test how much warmth lingered. Talani ran her fingertips along the edge of the table, noting the scratches shaped by old meals eaten alone. Billy set his saddle near the door and knelt to untie a bundle of kindling. "You'll sleep in a storage room once I clear space," he said without turning. "It's dry and warm when the stove's going." Nara crossed her arms. "We can sleep on the floor if needed." "You don't have to," Billy replied, continuing his task. Talani gathered the folded blankets from the shelf, waiting for permission. Billy nodded once, and she carried them into the storage room without further instruction. Saya began sorting through the crates they had brought from the settlement, deciding what would be needed immediately and what could wait until morning. Billy didn't interrupt. He watched them adjust to the space, noticing how each woman approached the unfamiliar environment differently. Nara kept a protective stance. Saya moved with careful practicality. Talani blended into tasks naturally, as if easing tension by helping. He felt a knot forming under his ribs. Not fear, not regret, but responsibility. He hadn't expected the feeling to show up this soon. As the light outside dimmed, Billy lit the stove and placed a pot of beans on the heat. The widows exchanged short glances, surprised he initiated the meal instead of assuming they would. He didn't comment on their reactions. He didn't know how to explain that he hadn't hosted anyone in years. They sat at the table afterward, Billy on one side, the widows on the other. The unequal seating felt strange, but none of them moved to correct it. Nara took the first spoonful, testing the temperature before swallowing. "You cook better than most men," she said in a flat tone, unsure if she should offer approval or maintain distance. "It's something I learned early," Billy said. "When you ride trails long enough, you either cook or go hungry." Saya studied him across the table, noting the quiet steadiness in his voice. "You've lived alone a long time." "Long enough," Billy answered, stirring his food without lifting his eyes. Talani's voice came softly. "Do you want us here?" Billy paused, the question landing heavier than he expected. He looked at her, then at the room, then at the stove's slow, rhythmic ticking. "I want you safe," he said finally. "That's enough to start with." None of the widows spoke for several seconds. Saya looked down at her bowl. Nara shifted her weight slightly, reassessing him. Talani breathed out slowly, releasing tension she had carried since the chief announced the arrangement. After the meal, the widows spread their blankets in the storage room. Billy stepped outside to check the sky. The horizon had darkened with the early signs of a cold front. He pulled his coat tighter, then looked toward the cabin window. Through it, he could see the faint silhouettes of 3 women adjusting bedrolls in a place none of them expected to sleep that morning. His chest tightened again. This was no longer a house built for one person. It was something else now, an unfamiliar shape with edges he didn't yet understand. Inside, the widows laid down in the narrow room. Talani whispered, "Do you think he means what he says?" Nara kept her eyes open in the dark. "We'll learn by how he acts, not what he says." Saya murmured, "Tomorrow will tell us more." Billy bolted the door and sat on the edge of his bed, listening to the quiet settling over the cabin. He felt the shift in the air, the kind that came with change no one asked for but had to accept. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls with a low, steady sound. Inside, 4 strangers tried to rest under the same roof for the first time. Nothing about it felt simple, but none of them were running from it either. The first morning in Billy Rowan's cabin began before the sun lifted over the low hills. A faint gray light seeped through the small window, touching the floorboards with a muted glow. Billy was already awake, sitting at the edge of his bed and lacing his boots with slow, measured movements. Sleep had come in short stretches. The presence of 3 other people under his roof created an awareness he couldn't shake. He wasn't afraid, but he felt every sound more sharply than he had in years. He stood, rolled his shoulders once, and reached for his coat. His breath formed a brief cloud near the door as he stepped outside. The air held a sharp cold that stung the skin on his face. Frost coated the ground in a thin layer, crunching beneath his boots as he walked toward the woodpile. He lifted a log, testing the weight before chopping it cleanly in half. The crack of the blade hitting the grain echoed across the yard, breaking the early quiet. Inside, Nara opened her eyes at the sound. She sat up slowly, adjusting her blanket before rising. She had not slept well. The unfamiliar room and the closeness of the other 2 widows made her restless. She stretched her fingers, listening to the steady rhythm of the axe outside. The consistency of the swings told her more about Billy's state of mind than any words he might have offered. He was unsettled but controlled. Saya woke next, blinking against the dimness. She pushed her hair back from her face and rubbed her hands together for warmth. Her first instinct was to check the cabin for threats or changes, an old habit she had carried since losing her husband. She scanned the shelves, the table, the stove, the closed door, and only then allowed her breathing to even out. Talani stirred last, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. She watched Nara and Saya for direction, unsure how quickly she should move in someone else's home. Her gaze drifted toward the door, where she heard the steady thud of the axe hitting wood. "He's been out there long," she whispered. Nara replied quietly, "He's sorting himself out. Leave him be." Saya nodded in agreement. "Let him finish before we start working." Inside the main room, they stepped out of the storage space and began moving with quiet purpose. Nara opened the stove door and checked the remaining embers. Saya pulled the kettle from the shelf and filled it with water from the bucket near the window. Talani gathered dried meat and ground cornmeal from Billy's supplies, careful to use only what seemed reasonable. Billy returned with an armful of chopped logs. He opened the door, the cold following him in a brief rush. The widows paused, each watching how he would react to their presence in his space. Billy hesitated only a second before placing the wood beside the stove. "Mornin'," he said, voice steady but cautious. Nara answered first. "It's early. Daylight's short this time of year," he replied, dusting frost from his gloves. Saya kept her eyes on him as she lifted the kettle onto the stove. "We start at breakfast, if that's all right." Billy gave a small nod. "Do what you need." He removed his coat and hung it on the peg beside the door. The widows resumed their tasks, but the atmosphere carried a new awareness. They were sharing routines, and none of them knew the proper rhythm yet. Talani stirred the cornmeal in a small pot. She glanced at Billy, studying the way he leaned against the table with his arms folded loosely. He didn't stare at them or hover, but he watched every motion with quiet attention. She wasn't sure if he expected something to go wrong or if he simply didn't know how to act around others so early in the day. Nara broke the silence. "We'll help with the animals after we eat." Billy lifted his head slightly. "You don't have to." "We do," Nara responded, her tone firm but not confrontational. "If we're staying here, we carry weight." Saya added, "We're not asking for shelter without giving something back." Billy didn't argue. He understood responsibility well enough to respect their insistence. "All right," he said. "Horses need water. Corral gate sticks in the cold, so be careful." Talani listened closely, committing every detail to memory. Breakfast came together quietly. They sat at the table again, but this time the distance between them felt different. The tension hadn't vanished, yet something steadier had taken root, an understanding that survival was easier when shared. Billy ate slowly, watching how the widows interacted. Nara took the lead without hesitation. Saya observed everything with sharp eyes. Talani stayed gentle in her movements, careful not to disrupt the others. Halfway through the meal, Billy finally voiced the question he'd carried since dawn. "If you need anything specific for the room, tell me." The widows exchanged glances. Nara said, "Shells would help." Saya added, "More hooks near the door." Talani spoke softly, "A thicker curtain for the storage doorway." "It gets cold." Billy nodded once. "I can fix all that." They finished eating with fewer pauses than the night before. When they stepped outside, the frost had begun to melt under the rising sun. Billy showed them the corral gate, the feed bins, and the well. He didn't lecture. He pointed, explained, and stepped back so they could see things for themselves. Nara tested the gate, confirming his warning about the sticking hinge. Saya checked the horse's hooves for ice buildup. Talani filled a bucket with water and carried it carefully to the trough. Billy watched them work. He felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, a mixture of relief and caution. They weren't helpless. They weren't passive. They were capable women who didn't shrink from effort. He respected that more than he expected. As they moved through the morning tasks, the uneasiness of the previous night eased inch by inch. Billy's land no longer felt like a place built for one person. It felt like a place adjusting to four people trying to learn how to coexist without forcing anything. The sun rose higher, casting clearer light over the yard. For the first time since the arrangement began, the day felt like it held structure instead of confusion. Nara, Saya, and Talani stood together near the fence, each steadying themselves for whatever came next. Billy walked toward the shed to gather tools, glancing back only once. The new life forming between them was fragile, but it was real, and morning made that clearer than the night ever could. By the fourth morning, the cold had deepened enough that every breath carried a faint rasp, and the ground held a thin crust of ice that cracked under even the lightest step. Billy Rowan opened the cabin door with a controlled motion, letting the dim light spill across the yard. His body moved with a quiet purpose. He had work on his mind, and work helped him think. 3 sets of footsteps followed him out, each creating a soft thud on the frozen earth. The widows had adjusted more quickly than he expected. They learned the pattern of his mornings, the shape of his chores, the way he checked the land with sweeping glances before touching a single tool. What they hadn't learned yet was how he felt about sharing the space. He kept those reactions locked behind steady eyes and small movements. Nara stepped toward the woodpile without needing direction. She lifted a heavy log, tested its balance, and carried it to the chopping block. Her muscles tightened beneath her dress as she positioned it correctly. Billy watched her form, noticing she held the axe differently than he did. Wider grip, higher stance. He approached but didn't intrude. "Try setting it lower," he said, voice even. "Keeps it from jumping." She shifted the log and struck cleanly. Wood split with sharp precision. She didn't look at him, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "Better." He gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement she didn't need, but didn't reject either. Saya headed toward the horse shelter. She checked the roofline for new leaks and pressed her fingers against the boards to test their stability. Her movements were structured, shaped by years of managing repairs in her old household before illness took her husband. The way she touched each piece of wood showed a familiarity with work many underestimated. Billy approached with a bucket of nails. "Roof held during last night's wind," he noted. "It shook a little," Saya replied. "Not enough to fail, but enough to watch." He handed her the nails. "Take what you need." There was no hesitation in her acceptance, only a brief analysis of the nail sizes before selecting the ones that would grip best in winter. Talani walked toward the water trough with a calm steadiness. She carried 2 buckets without shifting her weight, revealing a quiet strength she rarely showed in other moments. When she reached the trough, she knelt and checked the ice layer with her knuckles, testing thickness before breaking it with controlled strikes of a wooden mallet. She removed the frozen pieces and refilled the basin, her face soft but focused. Billy leaned against the fence, watching her work. She glanced up, the movement small but aware. "Too much ice this morning," she said gently. "Colder than yesterday." "Cold's settling in early this year," Billy replied. "Good that you broke it fast." Talani dipped her chin slightly, accepting the comment without discomfort. She seemed to speak more easily in moments where her hands were busy. As the morning continued, the 4 of them drifted into a shared rhythm. No orders were given. No arguments rose. Each person worked according to ability, and each task carried weight. They were strangers still, but the land didn't allow hesitations. It demanded cooperation, and cooperation created a bond none of them had intended. Inside the cabin, the stove crackled with a fresh fire. Nara entered first, carrying an armful of chopped wood. She stacked it beside the stove in a neat pattern, leaving enough space for airflow. Saya followed, hanging Billy's coat near the door after brushing frost from the collar. Talani set a pot of boiling water on the table for tea. Billy entered last. The warmth hit his face and softened the stiffness in his shoulders. He hung his hat on a peg and paused, taking in the scene. His home looked different. Not chaotic, just fuller. The presence of others didn't smother him the way he feared. Instead, it brought a steady hum that eased the pressure in his chest. Nara watched him quietly. "We finished all the outside work." Billy sat at the table, resting his hands against the wood. "You didn't have to take all of it." Saya answered, "We're not guests." Talani added softly, "We live here now." The statement settled the room. Billy felt something shift inside him. Not panic, not resistance, but a realization that he wasn't carrying the burden of winter alone. He cleared his throat once, searching for words that didn't feel clumsy. "I'll build the shelves afternoon." "Hooks too." Nara crossed her arms, evaluating the sincerity in his tone. "We'll help." He met her stare without flinching. "Good." They shared a brief, unguarded moment, one that held respect rather than suspicion. As midday approached, they moved outside again, gathering tools for the improvements. Saya held a hammer in one hand and a handful of nails in the other. Nara carried wood planks. Talani brought twine and a small knife. Billy directed them with short, precise instructions, not commanding but coordinating. Together they built the shelves, aligning the planks against the wall and securing them with careful strikes of the hammer. Each sound echoed through the cabin as the structure took shape. Talani arranged the blankets neatly once the shelves were set, smoothing each fold with a gentle touch. Saya hung the new hooks by the door and tested each one with a firm tug. Nara cleaned wood shavings from the floor with slow, controlled sweeps. When the work finished, they stepped back to examine the changes. The cabin no longer looked like a solitary man's shelter. It looked like a place prepared for winter with intention. Billy broke the silence. "Looks good," Nara replied. "It's functional." Saya smirked faintly. "Better than what we started with." Talani whispered, "Feels warmer." Billy felt the truth in her words. The air wasn't warmer from the stove alone. The presence of movement, cooperation, and shared purpose had changed the atmosphere more than fresh firewood ever could. He leaned one hand against the table, steadying himself against the unfamiliar swell of acceptance. These women were no longer strangers passing through. They were becoming something else, something built through work instead of spoken promises. Outside, the sky dimmed with the early fall of afternoon light. Inside, the cabin held 4 people learning how to function as one unit, not by choice forced on them, but by actions that slowly reshaped the boundaries between them. Work had become their language, and all of them understood it. By late afternoon, the sky over Billy Rowan's land had shifted into a darker shade of gray, the kind that signaled a night of hard wind and dropping temperatures. The widows noticed the change the moment the breeze gained force. Nara paused while collecting kindling, lifting her head as the wind pushed against her shoulders. Saya stepped out of the horse shelter to study the moving clouds, narrowing her eyes at their speed. Talani clutched her shawl tighter, sensing the cold settling deeper into the air than the day before. Billy noticed it too. He stood near the fence line, sharpening the blade of a small hatchet, but his focus kept drifting toward the horizon. He recognized the signs: rapid cloud movement, hollow gusts, and a faint rattle of branches. A strong windstorm was coming, not dangerous enough to destroy structures, but more than enough to test how well a household handled the long hours after dark. He walked toward the cabin and called to the widows, "We need everything secured before nightfall." Nara straightened. "What comes?" "Hard wind," Billy answered. "It hits fast in early winter." The 4 of them spread across the yard without hesitation. Saya checked the shutters along the cabin walls, pressing each hinge until she found the ones that needed tightening. Billy handed her a hammer without speaking. She accepted it with a nod and began reinforcing the loose sections. Nara gathered extra logs and stacked them inside the doorway, ensuring they wouldn't need to fetch wood once the wind picked up. Talani tied down the tarp over the firewood pile, her hands working quickly despite the growing chill. Billy moved between tasks, observing how each woman responded. Their coordination impressed him. They didn't need repeated instructions. They didn't freeze under pressure. They moved with focus, as though they'd prepared for storms their entire lives, because in their own ways, they had. The wind arrived just as the last tasks were finished. A sharp, heavy gust swept through the yard, bending the dried brush and pushing dust against the cabin walls. Billy ushered them inside and secured the door behind him. The latch clicked firmly, sealing them against the night's force. Inside, the stove glowed with a steady fire. The room carried warmth, but the wind pressed against the walls with a constant vibration that made the lantern flame tremble. Nara sat at the table, sharpening a small knife, her hands steady despite the noise outside. Saya checked the herbs she had hung earlier, making sure nothing came loose in the vibration. Talani smoothed the blankets in the storage room, adding an extra layer near the doorway to keep the draft out. Billy watched them from near the stove, resting one hand against the iron surface. He didn't speak right away. He struggled to understand a feeling growing inside him, a sense of ease, something he hadn't felt in his home for years. It wasn't comfort exactly, but the beginning of it. Saya poured hot water into 4 tin cups and placed one in front of Billy. "Storms always sound worse than they are," she said. "Wind like this keeps you awake," Billy replied. His voice was calm, but Saya noticed how his shoulders sat lower than usual, as if the presence of others eased a tension he had carried alone. Talani sat on a small stool near the stove, holding her cup in both hands. She glanced at Billy, then studied the fire. "We've had worse nights," she murmured. Nara inspected the knife blade and slid it into its sheath. "This place holds strong," she commented. "The walls don't shake." Billy looked around his cabin. He had built most of it with his own hands, one season at a time, never imagining it would shelter more than just himself. Hearing someone else acknowledge its strength tightened something in his chest. "It's held through every winter I've seen," he said quietly. The wind struck the roof with a sudden rush, making the women pause for a moment. Billy moved toward the window, checking that the shutters stayed locked. Nara watched him, sensing something heavy in his posture. She asked, "You've lived here alone for how long?" Billy hesitated before answering. 3 winters. For counting the year after my brother died. Saya's expression softened. "You kept yourself apart." "It seemed easier," Billy admitted. "Didn't want to bring trouble to anyone." Nara leaned back slightly. "People think solitude fixes pain. It usually just hides it. Billy met her eyes for a moment before looking away. He didn't dispute it. The wind roared again, louder than before. Talani flinched slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of the sound. Billy noticed her reaction and adjusted the stove vent to steady the fire. The gesture was small, but Talani watched it closely, recognizing the quiet intention behind it. When they settled for the evening meal, the storm pounded the roof in rhythmic bursts. They ate stew from tin bowls, the warmth cutting through the cabin's growing chill. Conversation came slowly at first, but the shared room and the wind outside pushed them into a kind of reluctant honesty. Saya asked, "You ever think about leaving this land?" Billy shook his head. Too many memories buried here. Leaving felt like abandoning them. Nara studied him with a new expression, not judgment, but an understanding formed from her own losses. Talani spoke quietly. Memories don't go away when you walk. They follow. Billy considered her words longer than she expected. Maybe so. The wind shifted direction then, causing a loud thud against the storage room wall. Billy rose quickly, but before he reached the door, Nara stood beside him. "We'll check it together," she said. He opened the door slowly. The room stayed intact, the blankets pinned against the draft gap holding firm. Talani had done it well. Billy let out a slow breath and closed the door again. Back at the table, Saya watched him with a thoughtful expression. "You don't panic," she observed. "Not even when the storm hits hard." "Panicking never fixed a broken roof," Billy replied. "Or anything else." The widows exchanged looks, subtle, layered, and thoughtful. When night deepened, and the wind still refused to settle, they prepared for sleep. Nara positioned her bedroll closest to the door, instinctively placing herself where she could respond first if anything happened. Saya settled beside her, calm but alert. Talani lay closest to the stove room wall, letting the warmth touch her back. Billy doused the lantern but kept the fire strong. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment, listening to the storm's rhythm. 3 people he barely knew were now depending on him. People who had already survived more than he could imagine. The weight of that responsibility didn't frighten him. It grounded him. Before lying down, he murmured something he hadn't said to anyone in years. "Good night." Nara answered first, steady and sincere. "Good night." Saya followed. "Rest easy." Talani whispered last. "We're safe here." Billy closed his eyes, feeling the truth of her words settle into the room. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the cabin. Inside, for people faced the storm together, each carrying their own wounds, each slowly learning to trust the presence of the others. The storm eased by morning, but the cold that followed settled deep into the land. Frost clung to every blade of grass, and thin sheets of ice formed in the shallow dips across the yard. The sky held a pale, washed-out tone that made everything look sharper than usual. Billy Rowan stepped outside first, crunching the frost under his boots, his breath drifting upward in small white clouds. The air had that brittle stillness he recognized, the quiet that came after a long night of wind. He walked toward the corral, checking the fence posts one by one. The storm hadn't broken anything, but he wanted certainty. When he reached the far corner, he paused, resting one hand on the top rail as he inhaled slowly. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking only of chores. He was thinking about the 3 women sleeping inside his cabin. The thought unsettled him, not with fear, but with responsibility he didn't know how to navigate. Inside the cabin, Nara woke first. She stretched her legs and tested the room for drafts. The storage space held warmth better than she expected, and the blankets stayed secure through the night. She noted the slight ache in her shoulders, a reminder of yesterday's work, and stepped quietly into the main room. She saw Billy's hat missing from its peg and understood he was outside already. Saya woke next, rubbing the stiffness from her neck. She scanned the cabin, checking the arrangement of tools and supplies with the same attention she gave any place she stayed. She noticed the new shelves Billy had built and the tidy stacks the 3 of them had arranged. It struck her that nothing inside the home looked temporary anymore. Their presence had changed the space. Talani sat up last, her expression soft and thoughtful. She had slept lightly, waking several times to the sound of the wind, but she felt steadier than she had in days. She rose and tied her hair back, noticing how the cabin no longer felt unfamiliar. She stepped into the main room with small, quiet steps. Saya spoke in a low voice. "He's outside, checking for damage," Nara guessed. Talani nodded once. "He worries more than he says." The widows gathered near the stove to warm their hands. Nara added a small log to the fire, watching the embers catch. When Billy returned, he brushed frost from his sleeves and closed the door gently behind him. "The fence held," he reported. "Roof's fine too." Nara folded her arms. "You expected worse. Wind like that can pull nails out," Billy said. "Lucky night." Saya studied his expression, noticing he seemed more tired than usual. Not physically, but somewhere deeper. "You didn't sleep well." Billy paused. "Didn't want anything shifting without me hearing it." Talani glanced toward him with a concerned look. "You take too much on yourself." He didn't answer that, but the comment lingered, softening the tension around his shoulders. They shared a quiet breakfast, corn cakes warmed on the stove and strips of dried meat. The meal carried a new rhythm. The silence between them felt less rigid, less sharp. Billy caught himself waiting for their reactions to the food instead of simply eating. Nara noticed. Saya noticed. Talani noticed most of all. After they finished, Billy grabbed his coat and stepped outside to check the stream that fed his water barrels. Saya followed him a few minutes later, not because he asked for help, but because she couldn't ignore the slight strain she saw in his posture. She found him kneeling near the edge of the shallow water, breaking the thin ice with the handle of a wooden shovel. He didn't turn when she approached. He simply shifted the shovel to give her room. "That ice comes back faster each day," she said. He nodded. "Winter settles quicker out here than closer to the settlement." Saya crouched beside him. "You used to live around people?" "Once," he answered. "Didn't stay long." "Before your brother passed," she guessed. Billy pressed the shovel deeper into the water. "Yeah." Saya didn't pry further. She knew grief when she saw it, knew how it changed a person's decisions until solitude felt safer than connection. She dipped her fingers into the icy water, testing the flow rate. "The stream's clear. No debris." "Good," Billy murmured. The conversation ended, but the quiet between them held something steady. An understanding formed without pressure. Meanwhile, Nara and Talani worked near the cabin, repairing a weak section of the woodpile awning. Talani handed Nara nails one at a time, her breath forming small puffs in the cold air. "He's different today," Talani said. Nara hammered a nail into the beam. "Storm nights get to people." "Not fear," Talani replied. "Something else." Nara paused, evaluating the truth in that statement. Billy wasn't shaken. He was thoughtful, as if the storm had brought something to the surface he hadn't wanted to look at. Billy and Saya returned to the yard soon after. Nara gave him a direct look. "Everything good with the stream?" "Flow's steady," Billy answered. "No blockages." Talani smiled gently. "Then we're set for now." Billy looked at her longer than he meant to. Her calmness affected him more than he expected. He shifted his gaze toward the shed to break the moment. "I'll mend the broken handle on the grain scoop," he said. Saya stepped forward. "I'll fetch the replacement wood." Nara lifted the awning's hammer. "I'll finish the top beam." Talani wiped frost from her hands. "I'll bring warm water." It wasn't planned, but each person chose a task that fit them naturally. The cooperation had stopped feeling forced. By midday, they gathered near the corral to work on the grain scoop. Billy shaved the edges of a new wooden handle with a small knife, while Saya observed his technique. Nara tightened the metal ring that would secure the handle. Talani held the bucket steady, ensuring nothing tipped. As they worked, a gust of cold wind swept through the yard. Talani's hair whipped across her face. Billy reached out instinctively and brushed the strands away, not touching her skin but guiding the hair aside with his gloved hand. The action froze the others in place. Billy pulled his hand back immediately, his expression tightening. "Sorry," he muttered. Talani lowered her eyes. "It's all right." Nara watched closely, her face unreadable. Saya studied Billy with new understanding, detecting a shift in him, a crack in the wall he kept around himself. The wind calmed again. Billy set the handle into the grain scoop and tapped the metal ring into place. The widows returned to their tasks without comment, but the air between them felt changed. Something small but undeniable had passed through the group, an instinctive moment that revealed more connection than any of them had expected. When the sun began to drop, Billy stood near the fence and watched the land. The widows finished their final chores and approached the cabin together. Talani glanced back at him once, not lingering, not questioning, just acknowledging the moment that had occurred. Billy inhaled slowly. The cold stung his lungs. The distance he had maintained since their arrival was weakening. He felt it, and they felt it. Nothing grand had happened, but the barrier between four wounded people had shifted, and none of them could pretend otherwise anymore. The next morning arrived with a sharp blue sky and air cold enough to sting the lungs. Frost clung thick along the fence, turning every rail into a pale line against the earth. Billy Rowan stepped onto the porch and paused, feeling the cold bite into his cheeks. The storm had passed, but the land held onto the memory of it. He scanned the yard out of habit, checking the corral, the shed, and the distant tree line. Nothing seemed out of place. Inside the cabin, Nara folded her blanket with slow, deliberate movements. She had slept lightly and woke more alert than usual. Saya prepared a small pot of tea, lifting the kettle with careful hands. Talani tied her hair back, smoothing the braid down her back as she stepped into the main room. Each woman carried a different kind of tension, none of it hostile, but all of it shaped by the moment they shared the day before. Billy walked back inside, stamping frost from his boots. He removed his gloves and hung them near the stove. "Stream didn't freeze deeper," he said. "We'll have water for the day." Nara studied him for a moment. "You checked it early." "Habit," Billy replied. Talani poured a small amount of hot water into a tin cup and offered it to him. He accepted it without hesitation this time. She didn't miss that detail. They sat around the table, eating a quiet breakfast of warmed bread and dried fruit. Saya noticed Billy's glances toward the window, short, measured, watchful. "Something bothering you?" she asked. Billy shook his head lightly. "Just thinking about repairs I've put off too long." Nara narrowed her eyes. "Which ones?" "Smoke shelf in the stove needs tightening," he explained. "Shed door needs a new crossbeam. And the corral post on the north corner wobbles." Nara nodded. "We'll handle the post today." "We?" Billy repeated. Saya smirked faintly. "You're not doing it alone," Talani added. "Sharing the work makes it lighter." Billy looked down at his cup, hiding the small shift in his expression. "All right." After breakfast, they stepped outside together. The sunlight had strengthened enough to soften the frost along the fence line. Billy walked toward the corral with a hammer and nails. Nara carried rope and a spare rail. Saya followed with a bucket of tools. Talani trailed slightly behind, holding a wool cloth to keep her hands warm. The damaged post leaned at an angle, its base loosened by months of shifting ground. Billy knelt to assess it, placing his hand at the joint. "It needs resetting," he said. Nara crouched beside him. "Lift on 3. Billy nodded. They counted silently and heaved the post upright. Saya positioned the rope and secured it around the top rail, holding the post steady as Billy drove the first nail into place. Talani handed him the next nail without being asked. For several minutes, only the sound of the hammer filled the yard. When Billy stepped back, the post stood firm again. Saya dusted her hands. "Better than before." Nara smirked. "Won't fall unless a buffalo hits it." Billy's shoulders eased. "Good work." He meant it. All of them understood the sincerity. They moved on to the shed next. The crossbeam had cracked near one end. This would weaken from seasons of rain and sun. Billy removed the damaged section while Nara held the lantern steady. Saya measured the replacement plank, marking the edge with a small notch. Talani swept debris from the shed floor, her movements gentle but efficient. When a new beam slid into place, Billy let out a slow breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "This will hold," he said. Saya stepped back, observing him closely. "You look like you've carried that worry for months." "Didn't have help," Billy admitted. Nara's tone softened. "Rare for her." "You do now." Billy looked up at her. No bravado, no distance, Just a simple acknowledgement that her words carried weight. Inside the cabin at midday, they ate a meal of boiled potatoes and herbs. Talani placed bowls in front of each person, taking care to divide them evenly. Her hands moved with a gentleness that drew Billy's attention more often than he intended. She noticed his glances, but didn't comment. After eating, the four of them sat in a rare moment of stillness. The stove hummed quietly. Sunlight slipped through the small window, landing across the table in a thin line. Saya broke the silence. Makona chose this arrangement to protect us, but he didn't say how long we should stay. Nara leaned her arms on the table. The season was the rule. Talani looked toward Billy then, her voice low. But seasons change. Billy felt his heartbeat tighten. He wasn't ready to answer anything about the future, but he wasn't running from the question either. "We'll figure that out together," he said, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. Nara blinked once, taken aback by the word together. Saya stared at him, seeing more than he meant to reveal. Talani lowered her gaze, and a small warmth settled over her expression. In the afternoon, Billy began sanding a plank for repairs inside the cabin. Talani approached him with a bowl of warm water. "For your hands," she said quietly. Billy hesitated, then dipped his fingers into the water. The heat soothed the cold stiffness, and he let out a breath he didn't intend to release aloud. Talani watched him, noting how rarely he allowed himself any relief. "You don't need to carry everything alone," she whispered. Billy lifted his eyes. "I don't know how to do it any other way." "Then learn with us," she replied. He didn't answer, but something shifted behind his expression, something new and unguarded. By evening, the sky turned a deep orange as the sun dipped behind the distant ridge. Nara and Saya prepared supper, while Talani brushed down the horses with slow, careful strokes. Billy stood nearby, repairing the last loose hinge on the shed door. Every now and then, his eyes drifted toward the women without realizing it. When they gathered for the evening meal, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt different, no longer cautious, no longer strained. There was a quiet steadiness to it, shaped by shared work and a growing sense of belonging. Halfway through the meal, Nara spoke plainly. "We've seen how you live. You give more than you say." Billy looked at her sharply. "What's that mean?" "It means you don't push us," she said. "You don't order. You don't take advantage. Men like that are rare." Saya added, "You treat us like equals, not burdens." Talani finished softly, "That matters." Billy felt the weight of their words settle deep in his chest. He didn't know how to respond, so he didn't try to soften the truth. "I'm just doing what feels right." The three widows exchanged glances, each one carrying recognition, gratitude, and something slowly turning into trust. For the first time since they arrived, Billy did not feel like a man hosting strangers. He felt like part of something forming around him, something fragile, steady, and real. The following morning arrived with a dull gray sky and a quiet that felt strangely expectant. The cold hadn't eased, but the wind had softened. Billy Rowan stepped outside first, letting the door close behind him with a gentle thud. The yard looked still, almost frozen in place. His boots pressed into the frost-covered ground as he walked toward the corral, inspecting each post and rail with habitual care. Nothing seemed out of place, yet something inside him felt unsettled. He leaned his forearms against the top rail, watching the horses shift their weight in slow, steady movements. The base snorted once, releasing a small cloud of steam. Billy exhaled through his nose, tightening his jaw. The widows weren't just temporary guests anymore. They had settled into the rhythm of his land the same way winter settled into the valley. Unexpected, firm, and altering everything in its path. He wasn't sure what he should do with the feeling. Inside the cabin, Nara tied her hair back and tightened the laces of her dress. She had sensed Billy's inner shift the past few days. He said little, but she could read the tension in his shoulders and the way he lingered near them longer than before. She stepped toward the stove, checking the embers before preparing tea. Saif sat at the table, sharpening a small knife against a whetstone. Her eyes were sharp, focused, but she was thinking rather than guarding. Billy's behavior yesterday hesitant moments, softened tone, had caused something in her to shift as well. Talani folded the blankets in the storage room with slow, thoughtful movements. Her mind replayed small things. Billy's instinctive gesture brushing her hair aside, his quiet promise to handle the future together, and the way he watched the three of them with a mixture of caution and pull he didn't attempt to hide. She didn't want to misread him, but she couldn't ignore how different he seemed from the men she had known before. When Billy re-entered the cabin, his boots thudded against the floorboards. The widows looked up almost in unison. He paused near the door, removing his gloves and setting them on the shelf. "Makona's coming," he said. Nara stiffened. "Today. Just saw smoke signals near the ridge," Billy explained. "Means he plans to visit by midday." Saya's eyebrows tightened. "He wants to check on us." Talani folded her hands in front of her. "Or see if we wish to return." Billy cleared his throat. "I don't know what he expects, but I want you prepared." The cabin fell into a heavy stillness. Each woman absorbed the idea differently. Nara felt a familiar defensive spark rise in her chest. She hadn't decided anything yet, and she didn't like being cornered into answering questions she wasn't ready for. Saya felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the weight of choice. Returning to the settlement meant going back to a routine built on loss. Staying here meant walking into something unknown but steady. Talani felt her stomach tighten. She didn't want to leave. The cabin had become a place of warmth, routine, and safety, things she hadn't felt for a long time. Billy noticed the shift in the room. "No one has to answer him right away," he said. "He just likes to see how things are going." Nara responded with a low voice. "He'll ask more than that." Billy didn't argue. She was right. Before the elder arrived, the four of them prepared the homestead for the day. Nara swept the yard, brushing aside frost from the front steps. Saya repaired a loose segment of the woodpile awning, replacing a weak nail with firm precision. Talani fed the horses, rubbing their necks as they chewed through the hay. Billy stood near the shed, cutting a fresh plank he planned to use for reinforcing the inner wall. They worked quietly, aware that the day carried more weight than the others. By midday, the sound of approaching hooves echoed from the ridge. Chief Makona rode into the yard on a sturdy brown horse, his posture steady despite the cold. He dismounted with controlled ease, his boots pressing into the frosted dirt. The widows gathered instinctively behind one another, not in fear, but in unified caution. Billy stepped forward, meeting the elder halfway. Makona studied him for a moment. "You look different, Rowan." Billy didn't flinch. "Been busy." "And they?" Makona asked, glancing toward the women. "They work hard," Billy said. "Fit in better than I expected." Nara stepped forward. "We're managing fine." Saya added, "We've kept the place in order." Talani finished softly. "It feels steady here." Makona listened to each of them with quiet assessment. He stroked his chin, then looked at the cabin. "This arrangement was meant for the cold season only. I came to see if you're holding up, or if this has become something else." Billy inhaled slowly. "It's working." Makona turned his attention to the widows. "And you three?" Nara lifted her chin. "We're safe." Saya crossed her arms. "We are valued." Talani lowered her eyes. "We're not ready to leave." The elder nodded once, absorbing their words without reaction. Then he looked at Billy again. "If they remain past the first thaw, it should be by choice. Not obligation. Not pity. Mutual agreement." Billy felt something strike deep inside him, a mix of relief and tension. "I understand." Makona walked toward the corral, examining the repairs, the arrangement of the yard, and the structure of the cabin. He saw the improvement in every direction. It no longer resembled a solitary man's home. It resembled a shared dwelling, steady, functional, and lived in by people who trusted one another. When he approached Billy again, he spoke quietly. "You didn't want company, but you've accepted it. They didn't expect shelter, but they've taken it. I see no trouble in that." Billy nodded once. "No trouble." Makona swung into the saddle, preparing to leave. "The season will decide the rest. Until then, do right by each other." As the elder rode away, the silence he left behind pressed heavily on the four people standing in the yard. Nara broke it first. He saw more than we said. Saya murmured, "He always does." Talani looked toward Billy, her voice steady but soft. "Do you want us to stay when spring comes?" Billy's breath caught for a moment. Not visibly, but enough that he felt it. He looked at each of them. Three women who had changed his land, his routines, and his guarded heart without meaning to. "I want you here now," he said. "And if you choose to stay later, I won't turn you away." The widows exchanged deep, quiet glances, each reflecting hope none of them voiced yet. Inside the cabin that night, the fire burned bright, pushing the cold away from the walls. The weight of the elders' visit still hung in the air, but something new had settled beneath it, a clear acknowledgement that the choice ahead belonged to them, and to Billy, not to circumstances. Their lives had intertwined, not through command, but through daily acts of care and cooperation. For the first time since they arrived, the possibility of staying no longer felt uncertain. It felt real. The morning after Chief Makona's visit carried a quiet unlike any the cabin had known before. It wasn't the silence of strangers or the careful distance of new arrangements. It was a calm built from steady days, shared work, and a choice none of them had spoken aloud yet, but all of them felt. Billy Rowan opened the cabin door and stepped into the cold, watching the frost break under his boots. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the chimney behind him. The land was still, holding the gray light of early winter like a held breath. He looked toward the distant ridge where Makona had disappeared the day before and tried to understand the shift inside him. He was no longer protecting a quiet life. He was learning how to live one with others in it. Inside, Nara tightened her belt and checked the knife she had been sharpening the night before. She looked toward the doorway where Billy stood and studied him for a long moment. Something about his posture had changed. He no longer carried that slight forward lean of a man expecting disappointment. He stood grounded, as if he finally recognized he wasn't alone. Saya poured warm water into a pot, setting it on the stove. Her eyes followed the soft curl of steam, her thoughts turning over the elder's words. She wasn't afraid of choosing a new life. She was afraid of hoping for one. Yet the last days had shown her something she couldn't deny. The cabin had become a place where her efforts mattered. Talani folded the blankets with gentle, unhurried motions. She paused once, brushing a loose thread away, then looked toward Billy's bed. She remembered how he had said, "I want you here now," and how his voice had held more truth than his face revealed. She didn't mistake the meaning. When Billy finally came back inside, all three widows looked at him, not waiting for instruction, but ready for whatever came next. "We have one more thing to settle," Billy said quietly. "Makona talked about spring, but winter's long, and I don't want anyone wondering where they stand." Nara crossed her arms, bracing herself. "Say what you need to say." Billy exhaled slowly, then leaned against the table. His voice stayed low but steady. "I'm not sending any of you away when the season ends. Not if you want to stay. This place is better with you. And He paused, searching for words he had never spoken to anyone since losing his brother. "I've gotten used to hearing more than my own footsteps." Saya's eyes softened in a way she rarely allowed. "You're sure?" Billy nodded. "I don't want this house quiet again." Talani stepped closer, her voice steady and warm. "Then we stay." For the first time since arriving, Nara didn't guard her reaction. "We haven't had a place that felt ours in a long time," she said. "This one does." That settled it. No ceremony, no long speech, just truth. Billy walked to the storage room and pulled out a small wooden box he had been working on in secret over the last few days. He carried it to the table and opened it. Inside lay 3 matching tokens, rounded wooden pendants, each carved with a slightly different line pattern. They weren't symbols of ownership or vows. They were a gesture he crafted from his own hands, shaped during the late hours of winter evenings. "I made these for each of you," Billy said. "Not to mark you as anything of mine, just to show that you belong here if you choose to." Nara lifted the first token, turning it in her hand. The pattern was simple, but every line was firm and intentional. She swallowed once, then slipped it over her head. "Fits well." Saya took the second. Her fingers traced the grain before she placed it around her neck. "You shaped this carefully." I wanted it to be right, Billy replied. Talani accepted the third with both hands. She held it gently against her chest for a moment before wearing it. Thank you, she whispered. Billy felt something loosen inside him, something that had stayed tight since the day his brother died. The rest of the morning moved with quiet purpose. They brought in more firewood, repaired a loose shutter, and prepared a stew large enough to last through the cold evening. The tasks felt different now, lighter, warmer, no longer held in uncertainty. Even the small sounds in the cabin, ladle against pot, boots on the floor, the soft scrape of a chair, carried a sense of shared life. As the sun lowered, Billy stepped outside to check the sky. The clouds glowed with muted orange, drifting like slow-moving shadows across the ridge. A faint wind moved through the grass, carrying the cold but not the bite of a storm. Nara joined him first, standing at his side without explanation. Feels like a place we can build on, she said. Yeah, Billy replied. It does. Saya walked out next, her footsteps light. If we start tanning hides tomorrow, we can patch the roof lining before the next freeze. Billy nodded. Good idea. Talani approached last, holding a warm blanket around her shoulders. She looked at the sky, then at him. The cabin feels different now. Billy looked at all three of them standing beside him, their breath rising in the fading light. It's our home now, he said quietly. Nara didn't argue. Saya didn't question it. Talani smiled, small, warm, certain. They stood together in the cold. For people who had survived loss, hardship, and uncertainty, and chosen, with clear eyes and steady hearts, to remain together. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed bright. The door stood open for a moment longer before Billy closed it gently, sealing warmth inside a house no longer meant for one man. That winter, the Rowan homestead became more than shelter. It became a family forged through trust, steady work, and the simple, unwavering decision to stay. The story ends here, with peace, belonging, and a home built by choice.